Exodus 15, we'll be beginning in verse 22. And we'll read through the end of the chapter, verse 27. Sherry says hello. Dahlia says hello. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Then when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah because they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Then he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the water became sweet. There he made for them a statute and a regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer." And they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. Okay. What do we think about that?
I'd like to know what kind of tree it was.
Sweet gum.
You think so?
Made the water sweet, so it went sweet gum tree.
Let's go to sweet cherry.
Sweet cherries, okay.
It just doesn't say, it just said, showed me the tree.
And that part of the world, wherever they find a tree, they're probably glad to find it. And not get too picky about what kind of tree it is.
They've got a grumbler on
Yeah.
for the people that see God's wonder, so to speak. The things that they had seen just coming out of the parting of the Red Sea. That didn't impress me. I don't know about them. It wouldn't impress me pretty much. And especially when swallowed up Pharaoh when he tried to get through the Hagar. The next thing you know, like just because the water is a little bitter, like we're not too happy. It just kind of repeats itself over the next 40 years. Stumbling around up and rocks in the sagebrush.
It is a repeated pattern of kind of a problem, or at least a perceived problem, a complaint, Moses making intercession, and then God is usually speaking and then certainly delivering them from the problem. Sometimes there is some deviation from that and you get punishment or whatever instead of maybe deliverance. But you do have, this is a good example of what's going to be happening. In a sense, they already did this because when they were backed up to the Red Sea, they cry out, Moses hears it, intercedes, God delivers. He delivers a word and then delivers them from the Egyptians. So this is, in a sense, a standard episode. It is noteworthy because it's in the same chapter. It just comes right after the Song of Moses and the Song of Miriam. So they were worshiping God, praising him for his greatness. And then 3 days in the wilderness later, they are unhappy with the quality of the water that they find. It doesn't say it can't be consumed or it's not safe to drink, but that it's bitter. They couldn't drink it. It was not pleasant to drink anyway. So
They weren't thirsty enough.
That was kind of interesting, kind of show their mindset, because they said complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" It didn't say we went to Moses with our concern and Moses asked God to give us water. It's kind of a different mindset, I guess.
They didn't.
Be dependent on that, knowing God would do it if you just don't ask or whatever you already know what they need, but to complain about it.
They didn't fill out a suggestion box card and put it in there. And of course, Moses had the suggestion box taped over so no one could put there. So.
You're less than 2 weeks out of a lifetime of always having everything patterned for them. I doubt that they had much leeway in what they did when they were in slavery. And now they're out and they're kind of beside themselves because everything is new.
Okay.
And they don't see any structure in what they're doing. And so, we can become very much complainers when we're in situations like that too. But this whole setup of having them completely out in the desert is the opportunity for God to show his power to them if they haven't already gotten it from the plagues.
And even though there's a lot of signs, and I think criticizing the people is fair, I think the story is intended to criticize them. At the same time, they are, in a sense, very vulnerable because they're being led and they don't know how it's going to go. They don't have a lot of say. They have no say over where they. In a way, they do. They end up having a say on how long it lasts. But when I was a kid, we'd drive from South Texas out to West Texas about once a year. We didn't go every year, and sometimes we went more than once a year. About once a year, we'd drive from Corpus Christi, which is way down south in Texas, southeast on the Gulf Coast, out to the Midland, Texas area, which is the way out in West Texas. And we'd go see my grandparents. That's where my dad's parents lived. And we'd be in the back seat, sometimes of a big old Pontiac station wagon, which was okay. And then sometimes in the back seat of a smaller vehicle, perhaps. When you're out there for that length of time, when you're a kid and you're in the back seat and you don't have any control over when the car stops. Are we there yet? And also, you get hot and thirsty in the back seat of the car. And if your parents are road warriors before the movie Road Warriors ever came out, I mean, Dad didn't like to stop, period. If he stopped, the belt came off and somebody wished he hadn't stopped. So, we wanted Dad to kind of keep going, but, all these vehicles now are there to entertain and keep the kids comfortable on a long trip. They got their own little TV screens to watch, and they're sitting there sipping on their juice box and, going right down the road. Well, that was not our experience driving across the great state of Texas. We sit down, shut up. I don't want to hear a peep out of you the whole time. It's just kind of, you will be there when we get there, that kind of thing. And I've got food. You'll get something to drink when we stop to eat or whatever, that kind of thing. And it does kind of lead to the powerlessness leads to complaining. Sometimes it leads to unhappiness. It is really hard to completely surrender and then be happy with the situation. And it is very new and it's very different. And they're coming out of what they have known into a new situation, and it's not perfect right away. It's not ideal, right? They don't go right into the promised land and occupy it and all they're struggling. There's a struggle between technical emancipation and the realization of God's purpose for them. PD?
A couple of things, and you mentioned that, and Ed mentioned that these things are for our examples. And in 1 Corinthians 10, Paul says, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us. And so, we need to do what God said in verse 26, if you of chapter 15 here. He says, if you listen carefully to the voice of your Lord God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all of his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians. So, yeah, there's been some coming and there will be more, but he said, behave yourself.
Well, he says also, I'm your healer. It's not that, to be a healer doesn't mean you never get sick. It doesn't mean there won't be a struggle. It won't mean difficulties. God will be the means by which they overcome the struggles that they encounter. And it is a test. And we get into chapter 16, maybe even somewhat today, and there's more tests to come. And in a sense, these are very simple tests. And the thing is, if you can't handle these things, you're not going to be ready to handle what comes ahead. And they really aren't ready to handle these things, and they aren't really ready to handle what comes ahead. The 40 years in the wilderness serves an important purpose in preparing Israel to be a nation that can go into a foreign land occupied by other people and take it from them. Yes, God is going with them. They have God on their side, but there's going to be wars. And even with God on their side, at times God withdraws the support and they lose. So they don't go undefeated. And some of the wins are kind of very improbable. It takes a lot of faith. We're going to take the great city of Jericho by marching around it a bunch of times and playing our horns. So there's a lot ahead of them. And you can't be, already he didn't want them to see the Amalek or the Philistines because they weren't ready for war yet. So he's got to get them ready for war. He's got to get them ready to be an invading presence. And, again, that's a difficult socio-political view of what they did, but that is kind of what they did. And they're not there yet. And if you can't take the waters being a little brackish when you get there, if that's going to throw you off your game completely, if you can't handle gathering the food correctly, either getting the double portion only when you're supposed to, but getting it when you're supposed to, that type of thing. If you can't handle these things, it's going to be a bumpy road ahead. And what we realize ultimately is, no, they can't handle it. That despite all of the things God has done for them, this group of people is not a worthy group to enter into the promised land. That's God's determination of them. Because except for two guys, this group of adults does not enter the promised land, despite seeing the plagues, despite seeing the burning of the Red Sea, despite eating the manna, despite the water from the rock, despite the quail, despite all of the stuff God does for them. It doesn't work. They are not worthy to get in. And that's, we looked at Paul in 1 Corinthians, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, looking at the baptism of Israel into Moses, crossing the Red Sea, water on each side, the cloud above. They're immersed into Moses. They come out a different nation. They go in fleeing Egyptian slaves, come out the nation of Israel. Nevertheless, with most he was not well pleased. So this group, it's time to really do some culling, as we say in Arkansas. Y'all call the herd around here, or do y'all do something else? I don't know. Call the crop. It's time to do the culling, and the culling is going to take out almost everything. So it starts with a test. How do you handle some discomfort? How do you handle some disappointment? And see and trust that God, if it's not what we want originally, God will remedy the situation. God will make it good, make it a blessing. God will transform our reality into something that is actually something we want to have. And of course, as I've said a few times in this course of study, I think you can fairly look at the history books, particularly of the Old Testament, the books that tell the story of the people of Israel from Genesis through their departure into Babylonian captivity. You can fairly understand those books from the perspective of someone, of a Jewish person in Babylonian captivity. And looking at this story of them being in wilderness wanderings for 40 years, that's a long time, isn't it? You can drive across the state of Texas 2 or 3 times in 40 years. You know. Maybe. There's the old joke about the cowboy who said, I can drive my truck all day and still be on my own property. I had a truck like that. I've got a truck like that right now. So, and even beyond just the Babylonian captivity, the history of the Jewish people has largely been diaspora. They have been away from their home. They are sojourners, they are strangers in a strange land throughout most of their history. And the wilderness wanderings tell us no matter how long you wander, you're headed home. That's where you're going to end up. And maybe that was part of the struggle of driving out west to see my grandparents. Is when I got there, I was going to be in Midland. So, that was, I wasn't going home. Home was back in the other direction. But that's the message here, I think, is also, first of all, we really do have to create a new people. There has been the baptism of Israel, but really the people that will enter into the promised land cannot be slaves in a sense. They have to be born free. The nation is born again, not just in the baptism of Moses, but in those wilderness of wanderings. The next generation has to emerge. We need people who either were born free or at least were young enough that they don't really remember being slaves. That is who is going to go into Canaan, who is going to go into the promised land. And then also that, you folks need to get used to wandering around. This is something that's going to happen for y'all a lot. So they can look back on this story and say, God has done great things for us. God has brought us out of oppression. Even after we're out of oppression, we're not home yet. It can take a long, hard walk to get home. But home is where we're headed. It's not a very lengthy story. This is the first, we're out of the Exodus in a sense. They're out of Egyptian bondage. And we're going into a new stage, which is the wilderness wanderings. And this isn't a real long story. Connected to the worship of singing the Song of Moses, the Song of Miriam. Israel's worship was very important, but worship was not an adequate substitute for obedience. You can't be a disobedient, recalcitrant people, come worship God, even technically in the correct format, and then go on and act like nothing's wrong and go right back to your disobedient lives. That's not acceptable. We see that in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 10 through 17. I don't care about your sacrifices and burnt offerings. I don't care about your worship because you do not live the way I want you to live. Again, God doesn't make sure they don't have a problem. He's not going to have the plagues of Egypt visited upon them, but God has, in a sense, other plagues visited upon Israel while they're in a wandering, don't they? Would you rather have a bunch of frogs hopping around or a bunch of snakes slithering around? Most folks are taking frogs, okay.
But I don't want them in my bed.
Kim says hello. Good to see Kim here. So God is not going to lead Israel always in a path that avoids difficulty, that avoids challenges. David's 23rd Psalm, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. When is he walking through the valley of the shadow of death? While the Lord is leading him along the righteous paths. A theology and understanding that a relationship with God means you will not encounter problems, that God is going to keep you safe and secure from all alarm at all times, is not a biblical theology. It may be yours, it may be fine, but that's not the biblical one. The biblical theology is you will face danger. You will be at risk. You will face hardship and toil. And God will give you the grace to triumph over it. God, in the midst of that, in the midst of your enemies, will prepare a table for you. And that's what Israel is seeing here. This is the first encounter. They're out, they're free. Freedom isn't everything they may have thought it was going to be, but it's where they face a challenge and God delivers them from it. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 38 through 41. Elisha is, as usual, with a company of other prophets, and that they say the water is bitter. Well, the prophet said the stew is poisonous, and we don't really know why the water was bitter. We don't know why the stew was poisonous, but Elisha miraculously heals the soup or transforms the soup from being poisonous to being safe to eat.
It takes a little courage to take a bowl of soup after you get hurt if it's poisonous, and then somebody goes foo-foo and throws some stuff in it. It's good now.
You're going to want to see Elisha eat some of that stew first, aren't you?
You may want a food test.
Yeah.
Oh, you have a little thing.
Right. Well, it's surely.
Well, Elisha's prophets trusted him. Elisha took care of his company of prophets, and I think that's kind of a story that echoes what's happening here. And yet, at this point, there is this call to obedience, and Israel hasn't been really disobedient yet, have they?
Not necessarily.
Probably, but yeah.
Not disobedient.
They haven't. God hasn't said go forward, and they went backwards.
Well, they really haven't had that many commands at this point.
They haven't. They're just not real happy about it, and they're complaining. I got in the car. We were driving to West Texas. I got in the car. Maybe didn't really want to, but I got in the car. But that wouldn't have saved me from the whooping if I hadn't shut my trap eventually. And they will have to obey soon. And the next miracle, the next act of God's provision does require obedience. They have to do something a certain way. If they don't do it the right way, it's really not going to work. There's going to be a price to pay. And setting them up for the law of Moses is ultimately setting them up for the relationship between keeping God's commandments and experiencing well-being. A lot of people like to look at the Mosaic law and make it all about natural considerations. You don't eat pork because pigs are dirty. You can get trichinosis from them. If you cook pork properly, it's perfectly safe to eat. If you don't cook beef properly, if you don't cook certain fish the right way, it'll kill you. So all the unclean animals, people have eaten them all over the world for millennia. It's not just a naturalistic set of codes to keep you healthy. It's not just a health code. And yet there is, though, this linkage between obedience, keeping the law, and experiencing well-being in God's reality. in God's intended order for his people. Again, it's not always about sin in terms of when we don't experience morality. When we experience bad things in our life, it doesn't mean we've sinned. Doesn't mean we deserve it. We knew a lady in Bellevue. I think I've told you about her before. Her nickname was Butch, but she was very feminine. I don't know where she'd had it since she was a kid, and everybody called her Butch all the time. And she had and died from liver cancer. And we were told, I didn't try to check, I didn't hook her up to a lie detector test or anything like that, but we were told she never had a drink in her life. But she got liver cancer. Some people get lung cancer without smoking, and I'm not trying to condemn those who smoke and those who drink. But cause and effect is an attractive way of understanding the world, but that's not always how it works, is it? In John chapter 9, we have the story of the man born blind. Who sinned that he was born blind? They asked Jesus. No one sinned. It was a test, right? So that the power of God could be put on display. But as a default perspective on life, Israel can connect obedience to well-being. And when there is a lack of well-being, they can look and examine, and they're motivated to see how is our obedience. The lack of well-being is a symptom rather than disease. The disease is sin. The disease is disobedience to God. What you are experiencing is a result of that disease. It's not the disease itself. Don't want to get too political, but I look at a lot of our cultural problems that we have in America right now, and people are trying to fix those specific problems. And those problems, I think the problem with that is those problems are not the real problem. They are the symptom of the real problem. They are the manifestation of the real problem. And there are symptoms, sometimes American symptoms, not the same symptoms that the same problem might have. They may present differently in a different culture. But the underlying problem, the underlying disease of all is sin. And you can try to treat the symptoms. You're not curing the problem, and you'll just get a different symptom. Even if you're successful in treating the symptom, you'll get another symptom if you cure that symptom, because you still have the disease. But for Israel, and the default way of looking at it, when things are going well, it's because they're obedient to God. Therefore, they should give honor, praise, glory, thanks to God. And they should teach their children, the reason we've got it so good is because we're obeying God. You need to keep obeying God like we are teaching you and showing you, so you will have it good too. And while that is a logical way of understanding your reality based on being given the law of Moses, it does not speak so well all the time. It does speak somewhat to people who are not experiencing well-being. But when you are the righteous ones and you are not experiencing well-being, then what? When you are Job and you are righteous, what does God tell Satan about Job? Consider my servant Job, how righteous he is. There's a lot of talk in all those poems in the narrative of Job about how God is just and fair, and we pull those out and we end up sounding just like his friends. Is that who we want to sound like? The friends of Job? But ultimately, there is this, God is making that connection at this point, in this way. He's trying to create in them a heart that's willing to obey him. Because it's going to be very important going forward. They leave the bitterness behind and go to Elim, which is a really nice place. 12 springs of water, 70 date trees, both those numbers are symbolic of completeness, just as the number 40 is as well. In a sense, you can have the whole Exodus story kind of condensed into just these 6 verses. Israel distressed, crying out. Moses intercedes, God delivers. A call for obedience, brought to a better place. It's kind of the Reader's Digest version of, in a sense, really condensed. But in a way, you can. The inimitable Billy Graham used to say the whole gospel is John 3:16. Yeah, okay, in a way. Well, this is kind of the whole story of the Exodus in a way, in microcosm, in just a very condensed form. This is how God works with Israel to bring them into a good place. But Elim isn't the final destination. Elim isn't home. It is a very good place, though, and it shows Israel that God, may have to endure bitterness, but you will come to sweetness. You will endure deprivation, but you will rest and you will find plenty. Okay. It is an interesting little story. 6 verses that really kind of convey a lot. Okay, we've got a few minutes. We can get into at least the first few verses of Exodus 16. The next few chapters will go pretty quickly. I know we've been slugging our way through some of these other chapters. Let's just look at verses 1 through 7. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after the departure from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether or not they will walk in my instruction. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, "At evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord. For he hears your grumblings against the Lord. And what are we that you grumble against us?" What do we think about that?
Kind of like you said earlier, it's a repeat of the same type of story. They grumble and God takes care of them.
We don't have anything to drink. We don't have anything to eat. I don't have my Shrek isn't working on my video player.
It's a point that you brought out that after all of those that were in Egypt passed away, there's nobody to say, "Look at what we had in Egypt. Look at how good we had in Egypt." Those people are all going to be gone. And so, there won't be, sure, we know Israel was all about telling the next generation what had been going on and all of that kind of stuff. But still, those people aren't going to be there to keep bringing up, oh, but if we were back in Egypt, look at how good we had.
Well, and we talked, I think Mark made the point that they had seen God with the Red Sea. They had seen the plagues. They'd seen all of that. They believed because they had seen. Blessed are the ones who believe having not seen. It's going to be the people that didn't see that or remember it, or, it wasn't the defining moment of their life. Those are the people who are going to be blessed with the entrance into Canaan. So all of this obedience ultimately is couched in faith. And you can't take faith out of the equation. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. You can go through the rote technicalities of the law, particularly as it applies to worship, in part because it becomes so ingrained in your culture. But if it's not faith driven, it is not pleasing to God. If you keep kosher because everyone around you keeps kosher, because that's all the food there is kosher food. If you don't keep it because you believe that it means something, if you don't keep it because you want to be pleasing and acceptable to God, it's not pleasing to God. You can do all the great things. If you don't have love, you're a clinging symbol. So they can't just be the normal people that we read about. It's easy to look down on them. When you're uncomfortable and you don't have any control over your situation, it's easy to grumble, isn't it? That's the human definition. I just came through the airport yesterday. You don't think I saw anybody grumbling? How do you like it when you walk through the scanner and they're looking at all of you in the scanner, and then you come over and go, I got to pet you down, and I got to, oh yeah, well, you could lose a few, and pass on the seconds next time, big boy, and and then the flight's late, and then it's crowded, and they put you in the wrong seat, and they lose your bag.
Other than that, how were they?
Did you grumble?
I didn't grumble. It was smooth for me. I was traveling light, and that helps a lot when you don't have a whole lot to bring with you. There's this complaining that Israel is doing. It does show a lack of faith, and it's not like this faith is going to be given to them in a sense supernaturally. God is going to earn their faith. He gives them grace, free gift, but he's going to earn their grace. He's going to, earn their trust, earn their faith. They're going to see him over and over again providing for them, and that should give them faith in him. It's going to be less and less natural. Throwing a tree in the water to sweeten it up is pretty supernatural, but the water was already there, right? And then he takes them to a really nice place that has nice water and it has palm trees. Now we're going to go into a place where it's really bereft of the things that are absolutely essential for life. They're going to need more water. They're going to need more food. They're going to need meat. They're going to need bread. Where is it all coming from? Where is the bread coming from? It's coming from God. And we'll look at it more next week, but it comes in the form of the dew. The dew dries and becomes bread. Where does dew come from? It comes from there is evening and there is morning. A new day. You don't have to have a cloud in the sky to have a heavy dew, do you? You need a cool night and a warm morning. All that steam in your bathroom when you take a shower, it's not really steam, is it? It's a good thing it's not steam, because you'd be dead. If your shower water was boiling, you'd be dead. It's just really warm. It's warmer than the air outside of the shower. So you get condensation. It's the same thing as when you set your Coca-Cola down and you get all those beads all over the outside of it. Don't drink Coke. It's not good for you. I like it, but it's not good. Okay. Thank you for your attention and comments. Mr. Heisey will hopefully dismiss us in prayer.